right. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Elmore. I'm an extension specialist at Rutgers University. I focus exclusively on turfgrass weeds with my research and extension program. I work in cool season turf. So for those that don't know, Rutgers is in New Jersey. So I'm in the northeastern United States. I've been here about 8 years working in cool season turf. Before that, I was in Texas and Tennessee. So I do have some experience with warm season turf, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go today about warm season turf, although this seminar doesn't necessarily focus too much on controlling crabgrass and warm season turf, but a lot of the fundamentals and sort of things apply. So what I want to talk about today is, why did my crabgrass control fail? We're going to talk about programs, pros and cons of different things, and that sort of thing, because crabgrass continues to be an issue in cool season turf and lawns, despite being around for hundreds of years, and despite us having pretty good tools to control it. So we're going to talk about crabgrass today. Let's set up the biology of it a little bit. It is a warm season annual weed. So basically it germinates in the spring, grows through the summer, and sets seed in the fall. That's what a warm season annual does. And here we are in the winter time. So most of us in the country are looking at dead crabgrass right now. And what we are concerned about is the seed that's in the seed bank that will be next year's crabgrass problem. So just in general, crabgrass is most competitive in thin turf, low mowing, species selection, fertilization, some of those sorts of things we'll talk about today. All right, so in the northern United States, central United States, we're mostly concerned about these two species. When you get into the southern United States, there can be other species involved, but we're primarily focused on controlling smooth crabgrass, which is pictured on the left. And you notice there's no hairs on those leaves or the stem, whereas large crabgrass is very similar to smooth crabgrass, except that it's hairy. Sometimes it's called hairy crabgrass. Both weeds are very similar in terms of how we control them. Large crabgrass can be a little bit more difficult to control. All right, and why are we talking about crabgrass today? If we look at a lot of our weeds in cool season lawns, I picked a few of them here, and I sort of gave them a real generic level of difficulty ranking, right? I consider dandelions and clover, for most of us, are fairly easy to control. Clover can be a little bit more difficult than dandelion, but compared to dandelion and clover, crabgrass is substantially more difficult to control, even with pre-emergence options, post-emergence options, and those sorts of things. Now, it's not as difficult to control as some other weeds like rough stuck bluegrass or annual bluegrass. I think those are more niche problems in home lawns, and honestly, so difficult to control, it's sometimes not even worth trying to attempt it. So again, that's why we're going to talk about crabgrass control today. I also want to talk about, not only is crabgrass difficult to control, but I think especially compared to dandelion and clover, it's much more important to control it for the aesthetics and the function of the turf grass. So what we're looking at here is a picture of one of our research fields in the late winter, early spring, after we've tested some of the different herbicides for crabgrass control. So what you notice here, there's some squares or rectangles where we've got a pretty good stand of turf. It's perennial ryegrass. And then around those, where we didn't control crabgrass the previous year, or we had programs that did not control crabgrass very well, we've got very little turfgrass there. And this turfgrass is not only not pleasing to look at, but it's not doing the things that a functional turf stand needs to do. It's not holding the soil in place. It's prone to runoff. It's not going to hold up to traffic very well. Again, very poor stand of turf. Crabgrass is unique, and what I've seen is that when we have a severe infestation of crabgrass, or even a moderate infestation of crabgrass, as those plants grow through the summer, particularly with our cool season turf, they can really kill off the turf grass that it's competing with. And then when that crabgrass dies at the first frost, because it's a summer annual, what it leaves is these voids in the canopy, which could be infested with winter annual weeds, or often they just lay bare through the winter, even into the following spring. So if you had clover or dandelion, which are perennial weeds, I'm not going to argue that they're maybe not as functional or aesthetically pleasing as turf, but they're not going to leave these giant, bare patches where they've outcompeted the turf. So I really think, here's another picture of, again, our research fields where we let that crabgrass go, we've got a real problem. So again, that's why I think crabgrass is really important to control, even if you argue, maybe it's not a big deal from an aesthetic perspective in midsummer. I still think to maintain our functional perennial turfgrass swards, we need to be able to control it. So the question is, how do we control it, and how do we get into a situation like this in a home lawn in the middle of the summer where we've got a fair bit of crabgrass? What are some of the situations that might have led to this? How can we break those down and try to improve them for the next year? Right, so here what we have is a picture of a tall fescue lawn in New Jersey, and this is in early July, and you see that lime green crabgrass kind of sparsely, throughout the image, and especially near the sidewalk. So we're going to kind of get into, why might we be having problems with crabgrass in this lawn and other lawns and those sorts of things as we go today. So we'll talk about some of those keys for crabgrass control. So one of the real keys, as a lot of you are aware, is pre-emergence crabgrass control, right? Here's a picture. Again, I keep going back to our research fields, but this shows, effective pre-emergence crabgrass control where we have those dark green rectangles, and less effective control outside those dark green rectangles where we've let the crabgrass go in this perennial ryegrass. So real keys for pre-emergence control. We're going to spend the next few slides talking about those and how to optimize our pre-emergence herbicide programs. So a question I often get is, which pre-emergence herbicide is best, right? We've got kind of 2 or 3 options that we typically use. And so the question I often get again is, well, which one's best? Which one do I need to use? And I think it's kind of a complicated question. And I think most of our pre-emergence herbicide products that are out there are all good products if they're used effectively and according to the label. So what I want to do is get into some of the keys on not maybe which product to select, but how to use the different products. And so one thing I've been impressed with as I've done these seminars over the years is how many people now are using split application programs. It seems like the number keeps going up year after year. Maybe we're seeing they're more effective. Maybe we've had more difficult summers and we know we need to use these things. But a split application program is just applying your pre-emergence herbicide over multiple applications. So you make one application, for example, at round 1, and another second application in the second round, 6 to 8 weeks later. And I wanted to pull this slide to highlight just the importance of using those split application programs. And that's especially if you find yourself making your first pre-emergence herbicide application relatively early in the spring, or maybe when it's technically still winter. So this is some work we did a few years ago, again, in New Jersey. So, if you're more north in Minnesota, for example, you could adjust these accordingly. So February, for example, in New Jersey might be more like a March in Minnesota. But we did this because we've had a lot of practitioners tell us, and we've seen them putting out pre-emergence herbicide applications in late February, early to mid-March, not too long after the ground thaws, because they have so many customers, they need to get around to all of them before the crabgrass really starts to get going. Sometimes it generates revenue during a time where there's not a lot of revenue being generated and those sorts of things. So we always got the question of, well, I heard you can put out your pre-emergence herbicide in November, before the soil freezes, and then you got it out already for the following year. And I had done some of that work back when I worked at Penn State as an undergraduate, and we saw that it worked fairly well there. But what we're seeing, I think, sometimes, especially in New Jersey, and I know I think in Minnesota as well, where you get the winters have been a little warmer, the soil doesn't stay frozen as long. We wanted to kind of take a look at this and see if, again, we put out a pre-emergence herbicide in February, how well does it work compared to later timings? So what this graph is showing is crabgrass control. And as we go from, a bigger bar would be more crabgrass control at the end of the summer, which is what we want. So the smaller the bar, the less crabgrass control. And the letters on top of the bars just denote statistical significance. So A is better than B, which is better than C. All right, so you'll see in the blue bar, when we applied a single application of a pre-emergence herbicide in February, and this was either a full rate of dimension, a full rate of prodiamine, or a full rate of pendimethalin. So that would be dimension, barricade, or prowl. When we applied those in February, we got significantly less control than when we applied them in April at a more optimal timing when forsythia is in full bloom. Now you'll also notice that when we made split applications of, let's say, February followed by June, so this would be somebody that wants to go out really early, we got about 10% more control averaged across multiple studies when we made split applications if we were starting early. Now the best control was still to wait closer till that forsythia full bloom timing, which for us is usually early April, and then to follow that again with an application in June. So the keys from this are, if you're going to go early, you definitely need to take advantage of a split application. And if you're not using split applications and you're making crabgrass pre-emergence applications at the appropriate time, you still might want to consider following that with a second application, especially if you're seeing poor crabgrass control. So here's an example of what we just saw in graphical form, highlighted in pictures, a little bit more of an extreme example, but this is what we often see. So on the left, you've got 1/2 pound of dimension applied April 9th, which for us is our typical crabgrass pre-emergence timing. So that's your typical, it's a high rated dimension within the label, but applied on April 9th. You can see there's plenty of crabgrass in that plot when we're evaluating it at the end of the summer. I don't know that that's commercially acceptable control, but again, when we test these in our research fields, we're operating under extremely high crabgrass pressure. Point with this slide is that when we make a split application that you see on the right side of the screen, but where that herbicide was treated, we've got almost 100% crabgrass control there compared to maybe 70 or 80% on the left side of the screen. And to a lot of you, 70 or 80% on the left side of the screen is going to be unacceptable to your customer. It's going to be unacceptable. So again, I want to drive home that point about split applications that maybe many of you are already doing, or if you're in a part of the country where maybe it's continuing to get warmer or you're seeing more crabgrass pressure for whatever reason, switching to that split program, again, you're taking the total amount and dividing it in 2 between your applications, 6 to 8 weeks apart. So we talked a little bit about rates. I don't want to get too much into rates because this is a presentation for a national audience, but for us in the Northeast, our typical use rates that are going to provide season-long crabgrass control are listed here for dimension, barricade, and pendimethalin or prowl. And again, these are guidelines, right? You want to tweak it from year to year. If for some reason things aren't working for you, you might need to increase the rate. If things are working well, you're trying to save money, you could potentially reduce that rate. But again, these are rates that typically hold up for us in moderate to high crabgrass pressure in the Northeast. Okay, so going back to our picture before, we just talked about rates and timings. What might have happened here, especially looking where these arrows are up against the sidewalk, right? There's crabgrass everywhere, but why is the crabgrass so much worse up against the sidewalk, right? What could have gone wrong? Well, it could be several things, and you never are able to point to just one thing, but these are a couple potential causes of that problem that we're going to get into in the coming slides, right? Is it application uniformity? Is it that, when that first application was made, or even the second, or maybe just one application was made for the season, the applicator did not feel comfortable getting close to that sidewalk? A lot of you are trained to not apply material onto hardscapes. Could it be that was the first time that operator had been on the piece of equipment, given that might have been their first year, and that, again, maybe learning how that piece of equipment works, right? Did we not get enough herbicide up against that sidewalk? Certainly possible. That's one of the reasons why I think in our research plots, split applications work better. And I think in the real world, sometimes they work even better, maybe, than in our research plots, right? If we think about, if you're going to make one application for the season, you've got one chance to get that application right. And if you mess it up, you don't have that second application there to sort of cover your mistakes. Again, especially if it's someone new on the job and they're not, attuned to all the nuances of the equipment and that kind of thing. Some other things that happen up against these sidewalks is we may have poor turf cover, just generally due to poorer soil conditions around the sidewalk, those sorts of things. It could be a sandier soil there, which needs more pre-emergence herbicide. So these are the areas where we usually see things. And if we do things like make split applications, we can help ourselves So I want to drive home the point about application uniformity and how there isn't a lot of room for error. And if an application wasn't made exactly at the intended rate along the sidewalk, we could have some problems. So these are some photos from our plots. And here's an example where you could imagine one of these plots could be, that area up against the sidewalk where the equipment was calibrated to deliver 1/2 pound of active ingredient of the dimension product per acre. But if it was on a granular or some kind of a ride-on sprayer, maybe they didn't get close enough to the sidewalk. And maybe they only put out, let's say, half of the intended application rate, which would be the plot in the middle of the screen. So they were trying to apply a 1/2 pound, they put out a 1/4 pound, right? Just these pictures just show the dramatic difference in crabgrass control we get, even if those applications are just a little bit low of the intended rate. So on the left, we've got 0.19 pounds of active ingredient applied very uniformly because it's in our research plots. And this would be slightly less than half of the intended application. In the middle, we've got 0.25. You can see it's slightly better, but that's not going to be commercially acceptable to anybody. And on the right, we're still not at that 0.25, but we're only, 20% low, but we're at 0.38 pounds. Okay, we're 20% low or so of that 0.5 pounds intended, but still, we've got breakthrough. Where I don't have it pictured, but in the 1/2 pound plot, we did not have any breakthrough. So you got to get that application right. You got to make the application uniformly. The other element is the poor turf cover we mentioned. We're going to talk a lot about this in the coming slides, but I've been surprised when we do trials that include a fertilizer treatment in with our herbicide. The fertilizer treatment's designed to improve the density of the turf grass and how much that helps out our herbicide program. So typically in our plots where I'm showing you, we've kind of got a worst case scenario, which is not uncommon in these lawns, but we've got really high crabgrass pressure, right? We've got a really strong seed bank from all the crabgrass that was there the year before. We often have, not the best turf cover because we're trying to get a lot of crabgrass so we can separate these chemical treatments. But when we do trials that look at a more programmatic approach, in this case, a fertilizer program plus an herbicide program, and you can see how much more control we get. So on the left side of the screen, we've got a pretty typical response from dithiopyr or dimension at 1/2 pound at the end of the season. We've got pretty good control, but there is still some crabgrass in there. You'll notice that turf is in kind of rough shape. It has not seen any fertilizer for the duration of the trial. But on the right-hand side, and this was the first time we'd seen 100% control in every single plot across all of our replicates, or when we repeat these treatments, that same 1/2 pound of dithiopyr, again, provided 100% control in all the treatments when we simply applied fertilizer in the fall and applied fertilizer in the spring as well before we made those pre-emergence herbicide applications. So again, this trial kind of started in November or October. We applied fertilizer as a fall fertilizer. We again applied fertilizer in the spring, the same time we applied our crabgrass pre-emergence applications. And with a really healthy stand of turf, those pre-emergence herbicides performed a lot better. So I'm not saying that would have fixed the problem in the previous picture we saw of the lawn up against the sidewalk, but anything you can do to enhance the turf cover is going to help out your crabgrass pre-emergence program. So what are some other things we can do to enhance turf cover besides just fertilizing, obviously? Higher mowing height is a really critical thing if you can convince your customers to raise that mowing height ever so slightly. Combining that even with fertility management is better. So this is a photo from a professor at Kansas State. This is sort of anecdotal observations, but I think it does a really nice job highlighting the difference between a simple 1-inch increase in the mowing height. So you see on the picture on the left, you've got an area at the end of the summer that has a lot of crabgrass in it. You can see that lime green crabgrass. And on the right, where the mowing height is simply 3 inches as opposed to 2 inches, there's almost no crabgrass. Okay, this is not a result of an herbicide. This is just the mowing height. Okay, and this is an anecdotal observation, but there's years of scientific studies that have found that if you can increase that mowing height, you have a lot less crabgrass. I just decided to show it with a picture instead of some studies. This is another example. This is a photo from someone sent me this photo. He's the one managing the yard on the left. This is tall fescue in Maryland. a relatively high height of cut, maybe 3 or 4 inches. This is in the middle of summer. You can see there's no crabgrass on the left side of that screen. Right, there's also a little bit of clover in that lawn. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But higher mowing height, 3 to 4 inches for tall fescue, compared to the neighbor on the other side of the street. Right, that neighbor's probably mowing at about 2 inches. They want to have their lawn mowed low. Maybe they like that aesthetic. But you can see all the lime green crabgrass in that lawn. That's going to be a problem whenever it dies out for the winter. Okay, so on the left, we've got, again, higher mowing height, very little fertilizer, but tall fescue doesn't need a lot of fertilizer. And on the right, lower mowing height, lots of crabgrass. And again, the lawn on the left has not seen any pre-emergence or post-emergence herbicide. So anything we can do to enhance that turf grass is really going to help us. Okay, so we talked about mowing height, talked a little bit about fertilization programs. Now, what about the turfgrass species selection and how that can help us resist a crabgrass invasion, again, complementing our herbicide programs? So here's kind of a general, I guess, depiction of what I've seen in studies and anecdotally over the years of how these different turfgrass species resist crabgrass invasion. So the ones with the most resistance in the green, the high, would be the most resistant to crabgrass invasion, and then the lows are the least. Okay, so some of our more popular species, perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass, are generally less resistant to crabgrass invasion than, say, tall fescue. And then we've got our fine fescue species, chewing fescues and hard fescues, that are the most resistant. Now, I'm not going to say you should pick a particular turfgrass species just on the basis of crabgrass invasion, right? It would not really be a good idea to select fine fescue species in areas of full sun, particularly in New Jersey. The chewings, the hard fescues, all of our other fine fescues generally do very well in the shade. But in full sun, yeah, they can resist crabgrass invasion, but they're also not very tolerant of traffic during the summer. They're not very tolerant of wet conditions, those sorts of things. So, but I do think the one in the middle, tall fescue, is a really good choice for a lot of us. It's not going to have those problems that the fine fescues do, and it's going to be more resistant to crabgrass invasion than perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures of that from a study that we're just about wrapping up here. So this is a study where we evaluated the effect of turfgrass species on crabgrass cover. I was surprised when I looked 3 or 4 years ago, and there's really not been a lot of studies, not necessarily very robust studies to evaluate how these different turfgrass species affect crabgrass cover. So we decided to do that. So these squares are just different turfgrass species. Sometimes the species are by themselves, and sometimes we actually mix them with a white clover, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what we did is we planted these species in the fall to a field that was previously pretty much 100% crabgrass. We established them, we fertilized them, and then after they were established, we only fertilized them if they started to thin out. So species like tall fescue got a lot less fertilizer than, say, perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass. We mowed at 2.5 inches and evaluated how crabgrass came into those plots during the summer. So you're looking at these plots in the late summer. And so because we're in late summer, you can see a lot of that lime green crabgrass in some of these squares or plots more than the others. So what have we found in this study? It just got to the end of its second year. We found that perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass had a lot more crabgrass in them at the end of the summer. And again, this is in the absence of a pre-emergence herbicide. You see the tall fescue and the hard fescue on the bottom of your screen have a lot less crabgrass in them, and again, particularly those fine fescues. So this is another component of it, right? Now, I know you're probably looking at the tall fescue picture and saying, well, that's still not acceptable. It's not 100% crabgrass control, and I agree with you. But again, we did not put a pre-emergence herbicide on these plots. We just wanted to evaluate the effective species. So what we're doing now is we started another study where we're going to evaluate the perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, and tall fescue under different rates of pre-emergence herbicide to see if indeed in tall fescue we can use less pre-emergent. And I suspect we will be able to. Okay, so another study that's been done, not on crabgrass, but I think it highlights some of the seed recruitment or seed germination issue we're trying to prevent when we have a crabgrass infestation. This was some work done at the University of Wisconsin several years ago, where they evaluated the Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, and other species with different fertilizer regimens. So what they did is they killed all the weeds on the site, they established the grasses, and then they fertilized them. They fertilized them all to get them established. And then in subsequent years, they either didn't fertilize them at all with nitrogen fertilizer, they applied high amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. So for example, you see 4 pounds of nitrogen per year is a pretty high rate, or they did a middle rate of 2 pounds. Now you see with the Kentucky bluegrass, when you fertilize it more, Kentucky bluegrass is a species that uses a lot of nitrogen. When you fertilize it more, you get a denser stand of turf, and fewer of the dandelion seeds that blew into the site were actually able to establish because it was a denser turf. You can imagine a similar thing with crabgrass. What was interesting with the tall fescue is even where there was no nitrogen applied, because tall fescue is a grass that needs less nitrogen, there was still very few dandelions in that plot. So this is a kind of an interaction of species and fertilizer program showing that if you just do what you need to do to create a dense stand of turf, whether it's species selection, whether it's mowing higher, whether it's more fertilizer, or likely some combination of all those, you can have a denser stand of turf that will help outcompete weeds. Okay, so kind of summarizing this, what does it mean? Basically, if someone asks me what herbicide program they need, I sort of try to talk about, well, what happened in previous years? How are some of your best areas? How are some of your worst areas? Because a program that works very well in one area, for example, where we have low crabgrass seed bank, turfgrass species, those sorts of things, a herbicide program that works there is not going to work in an area of poor turf cover where we've got a species that's going to thin out in the middle of the summer from disease or whatever. So where you have poor turf cover, you're relying more on your herbicide program. You're going to put it under more pressure, and you're probably going to need more herbicide. All right, so we talked a lot about pre-emergence herbicide products. Let's switch and talk about post-emergence herbicide products for crabgrass control. So again, these will be applied after the crabgrass emerges, usually June, July, and August. What are our different product options? So we've got the active ingredients, the 4 primary active ingredients listed here. We've got quinclorac, which is I think one that most of us rely on for post-crab control, phenoxaprop, mesotrione, and topramazone. So again, quinclorac is the big one, I think. Drive Accelerate Q4 contains quinclorac. Acclaim Accelerate is a new quinclorac product, Quintessential, and others. We're going to talk about these as we go. I want to briefly mention a new product that was just given EPA approval because it contains quinclorac. So this is a product called Lynchpin. It's made by Sipcam. It's a combination of quinclorac plus mesotrione plus halosulfuron. So what you'll notice is that with the premix of this product that contains halosulfuron, you will actually pick up nutsedge and Kalinga control. So this is a product that, again, you could apply post-emergence. The quinclorac is good on crabgrass. Mesotrione will help out for crabgrass control. And then you get the halosulfuron, which provides yellow nutsedge control. So it's a more broad spectrum product. We've evaluated it, and it provides control, similar to a mixture of quinclorac and mesotrione. So another product I want to talk about is Acclaim Accelerate. So a lot of you are familiar with Acclaim Extra. It's been around for many years. Enview just released the product Acclaim Accelerate last year. I just want to point out, because the branding is a little confusing, right? We've all said, for years I've just said Acclaim. Well, everybody knew that Acclaim was phenoxaprop. Now there's a new Acclaim product. So we've now got to say Acclaim Extra or Acclaim Accelerate. So just know that the Acclaim Accelerate product is quinclorac, very similar to Drive Accelerate or a lot of the other quinclorac products we've been using. All right. Another pre-emergence herbicide that's on the market, I'm getting a lot of questions about, is called Stricor. This is pithoxamid. The thing to know with this one is that it does not have the efficacy on its own, like a Dimension, like a Barricade. And we're trying to figure out the fit of this. I think it might have a potential fit in golf turf, like fine turf sort of applications, if it's flanked with a more stronger residual product. So for now, we're not going to talk about this as an herbicide in any of our crabgrass programs, but I just wanted to highlight it to your attention. Okay, so let's talk about some of these different active ingredients for crabgrass control and kind of the pros and cons, right? So we've got two products pictured here, and in the foreground below the pictures of the labels, you've got what the crabgrass looks like about a week after they were sprayed. So a lot of you are familiar with quinclorac, and also familiar maybe with the bleaching of Pilex and Tenacity, which would be topramazone and mesotrione. And so what you see here is that bleaching of the crabgrass when you apply topramazone compared to the more typical yellowing and necrosis of that crabgrass when we apply quinclorac. So that's a key difference between them. They're both effective options for crabgrass control, excuse me. But you'll want to know that you'll get that bleaching with topramazone. You'll also get it with mesotrione. The question is about tank mixtures with these. A lot of times I get questions about a tank mix of Pilex plus Drive, which is often called pile driver for the wrestling folks out there. So it's a tank mixture of two products that are effective for crabgrass control. And the question is whether you should make that application or not. What I want to show you is these plots from a study we did where we actually tank mixed quinclorac and topramazone, in other words, pile driver, or applied topramazone on its own. So where you see that intense bleaching, that is from the topramazone alone. What's interesting is when we combine quinclorac and topramazone, the bleaching from that topramazone, and it's similar with mesotrione, it goes away. Sometimes we get better crabgrass control, sometimes we don't, but just know that that bleaching goes away. So here's a better picture of that on the left, the topramazone alone, on the right, topramazone plus quinclorac. Okay, so that's a real quick overview of some of the active ingredients. Now, what's some of the nuance of actually controlling crabgrass post-emergence? Because it's very difficult to do. It's far more economical to control crabgrass pre-emergence. The reality is that pre-emergence programs don't often work as we plan them. We have problems. We pick up customers in the middle of the season, whatever it is. We often do have to resort to post-emergence crabgrass control. With post-emergence crabgrass control, the thing to know, and you've probably seen it if you've been in the business for a while, is that as those plants get bigger, they get much harder to control. So if we look at a one-tiller plant on the right side of the screen, and as that plant grows, it's going to get more and more tillers, or basically a tiller is just a stem. So you basically can count the number of stems to determine what stage of growth that crabgrass is in. And you're kind of estimating across, the entire stand or whatever. But basically, when the plants are small, they're one tiller. They'll start to grow 2. They'll quickly, rapidly go 4, 7, 25, whatever it is. But it's really, there's a lot of talk about crabgrass control, these different growth stages and that sort of thing. The bottom line, though, is that a plant that's one tiller is going to be a lot easier to control than a plant that's at 7 tillers. And I'll show you some of that here. Okay, so a one-tiller plant. If we look at the Acclaim Extra label, that's phenoxaprop. It says the rate you need to control it is 13 ounces to the acre. You can also use quinclorac at this stage of growth. Now, there's often this talk about quinclorac not working very well for some reason at this 2 to 4 tiller stage. I don't always see that, but these are the size of the plants that people are talking about when they say that. Okay. Also, going from a 1 to a 2 tiller plant, you can see how that rate of Acclaim that we need to get control increases from 13 to 20 to almost 40 ounces to the acre. So as those plants get bigger, particularly with Acclaim, you need a higher rate. Other products that you can use at this 1 to 4 tiller stage of growth are quinclorac, Tenacity, and Pilex. Often we can get pretty good control at this stage. It's not 100%, but it's maybe 90 to 95. Now, when the plants get 5 tillers plus, 7, 10, whatever tillers, it gets much harder to control. We still are using the same herbicide options, but just know that it's going to be multiple applications to get control. You're going to have to treat once and then come back and treat at least one more time to try to get through the season and get decent control. Okay, very hard to control at this larger stage. Here's some research we've done to kind of highlight that. This is crabgrass control in early September after we've made one application of either Drive Accelerate or Acclaim Accelerate. Again, the same active ingredient, the same rate, applied with a pre-emergence herbicide to prevent new crabgrass seedlings from germinating. So what we're looking at here is crabgrass control in the bars. The larger the bar, the more crabgrass control we get, up to 90 or so % crabgrass control. Notice the green bars on the left. Those are applications at the pre-tiller stage of growth, which for us was June 24th this year. The blue is 1 to 2 tiller stage. The gold is 2 to 3, and pink and red are larger stages. So what you'll notice is there's really no difference between how the two products work, which is not a surprise. They're the exact same active ingredient. But what you'll notice is the control declines as those plants get bigger, right? Those 5 tiller plants in the red bars, we only got about 65% control compared to almost 90% control when we applied to pre-tiller plants. So as the plants get bigger, you're going to need more product, in this case, 2 applications, basically from that 2 to 3 tiller stage onward. You definitely need at least 2 applications to get the job done. So here's just a picture of that, right? On the top, we have a tiller stage application July 3rd. On the bottom was the same product applied to the 5 tiller stage. We applied it August 2nd, and then we're evaluating control a month after that August 2nd application. Okay, that August 2nd application is not going to be acceptable to most of your customers in terms of control, and you'll need to make a second application. Or the one on the top, might be considered acceptable. All right, so another key with particularly quinclorac-based products, all of the quinclorac-based products, you want to apply them with methylated seed oil. This is indicated on the herbicide label for Drive Accelerate. You can see it's highlighted there that you need to mix methylated seed oil into this product. Now, it's easy to overlook this, right? It's a long label. Do I really need this methylated seed oil? If you've already bought the product and you don't have the seed oil, should I just go ahead and spray it anyway? I'm going to try to answer that question. Do I need to get the MSO? Here's some other work we did evaluating combinations of Pilex plus Drive, so topramazone plus quinclorac, aka pile driver, with the same application technique, just a flat fan nozzle. On the left, this is about 3 weeks after the application. Okay, we spray in between those blue dots. On the left, where we didn't include the methylated seed oil, it doesn't really look like that plot has been treated at all. When we add that methylated seed oil in there, you can see the dramatic increase in the amount of control. Now, it's still not 100% control, but we wouldn't expect a completely clean plot there on the right-hand side of the screen because we're spraying crabgrass at that 2 to 4 tiller growth stage where we know we're going to need more than 1 app. But at least when we've added that methylated seed oil on the right-hand side of the screen, we're making progress, right? But on the left, again, you can hardly tell that was treated. So really key to add that methylated seed oil. It helps the product get into the leaf tissue. Quinclorac in particular is really sensitive to not having that methylated seed oil in there. All right. The methylated seed oil improves the control of Drive Accelerate, Claim Accelerate, Q4, Pilex, or Pilex plus Drive, aka Pile Driver. All these products, and it's listed on the label, will benefit from the inclusion of MSO, and we've got our own data to show that. Okay, so we're kind of wrapping up our discussion about different products. I get a lot of questions about different products and that kind of thing. And one resource that's available to you, if you want it, is a guide that's produced by myself and Dr. Aaron Patton. We are about to release the 2025, the 13th edition of this book. And really what it does is it has all the different products that are registered for use in turfgrass weed control in it. It's intended as a desktop reference guide. It's about 130 pages. And we try to give you a resource to answer those questions about how do these products work? How do they work on different weeds? Is this product right for this weed? And so we've got, pictures of weeds, information on how to control certain weeds. And I think one of the most valuable things in the guide are these tables you see on the right side of the screen. So this is an example of all the broadleaf herbicides, or some of them. There's hundreds of them, but the first page of many highlighting how some of these different broadleaf herbicides work on different broadleaf weeds, turfgrass tolerance to these herbicides. Here's another example. We were just talking about crabgrass. So this is post-emergence efficacy of various herbicides against grasses. So you can see we just talked about crabgrass, and we've got highlighted in this table how effective are these different products against crabgrass? Poor, good, fair, or excellent, right? So again, this is a resource for you. The cost is basically just to recover the cost to print the guide. The 2024 version is available in some bookstores right now. We're about to release the 2025 version. So if it were me, I would just wait for that 2025 version because we add new herbicides each year as products are released. All right, so we talked about how do we apply those post-emergence herbicides, when do we need to apply them? And that was in a research setting scenario. We're going back to this uniform application discussion and talking about the importance of a uniform application, and I think also making multiple applications, which is again very difficult to do. So this is a municipal area. This was in August in central New Jersey. You can see there's a lot going on here, right? We've got strips of what looks like brown grass. That is actually where it looks like a ride-on sprayer actually treated with a post-emergence herbicide for crabgrass control. So the green in between is actually mostly crabgrass. That's where the sprayer did not spray any herbicide at all. And so the crabgrass there is definitely not affected. And then we'll talk about what's going on in the middle here as well. But a real key though, even with post-emergence herbicides, we talked about it with pre's, but uniform application, right? Clearly here the operator didn't know they weren't covering the whole field, and they left it. Now the challenge here, I think, is with post-emergence herbicide applications, if you're on a 6-week rotation, the applicator likely made this application, and if the customer doesn't say anything, they will come back 6 weeks later, and maybe they'll see the streaks and maybe they won't. Because I'll tell you, even in these areas where the crabgrass is looking necrotic, if a second application isn't made, that crabgrass is going to recover. So again, I'm just highlighting the challenges of pure post-emergence crabgrass control without a pre-emergence. It's very difficult to do, and the lack of uniform application here is making it more challenging. All right, here's just another picture of that. Okay, so the challenges in this situation, when you get called by a customer who maybe you didn't have before, it says, I want you to control this crabgrass, is we not only have the challenge of just treating the entire area, but the crabgrass is very large at this point. It's going to be a multiple application scenario. The other challenge is, and I kind of mentioned this, that the lawn care company might not even notice if they don't come back for 6 weeks, is that when we're in midsummer for post-emergence crabgrass control, a 2 to 3 week reapplication interval is ideal. That's 2 to 3 weeks is about when the crabgrass starts to recover from those quinclorac applications. And if you wait another 3 weeks, the crabgrass will almost completely regrow and you're kind of back to square one. So if possible, shortening those application intervals when we're in that July and August time period will really help you. I also want to talk about application technology with these different post-emergence herbicides. We get questions about, can I use the Chem1 gun? Or particularly with these low volume sprayers like the Z sprayer, where we're spraying at 10 to 15 gallons per acre, compared to what we usually do in our research trials, which is the 1 gallon per thousand or 44 gallons to the acre. So the questions are usually, particularly at those low volumes, are the products working as well at that 10 to 15 gallon per acre? So we did some work to evaluate that. We evaluated the different herbicide combinations pictured on the bottom of the screen: Drive Accelerate plus Pilex, Drive Accelerate plus Pilex with the methylated seed oil, which is the ideal formulation, or tank mixture. We also evaluated Q4 plus, which is a quinclorac containing product. It also contains 2,4-D and some other things for broadleaf weed control. And then just Drive Accelerate alone without the Pilex, or just Drive without the pile driver. So here's what we're looking at in terms of control. This is a 2 application scenario because we were in mid-July, right? You see our application timings on the right side of the screen there are July 19th, followed by August 23rd. So when we're in, basically for us in New Jersey, once we get to the month of July, any crabgrass that survived a pre-emergence application, it's probably a multiple application scenario. Okay, so again, the objective here is more to evaluate the different application techniques than the different chemistries. The different chemistries are just tank mixtures I just talked about are just in the different colored bars. So Pilex plus Drive is in the purplish blue, with the methylated seed oil is green, so that's our best. You can see, again, different study than we talked about earlier, but adding that methylated seed oil gives us a bump in control. So let's focus on our most effective treatment, that pile driver. You can see that there's not a difference between those three bars. The bar on the left, the green bar on the left would be the flat fan, the green bar in the middle, the Chemlon gun, the green bar on the right, the one we're most interested in is that Z spray, that low volume, did not affect things. So I think that's the key is if you're in that 10 to 15 gallon per acre, especially up at 15, we don't really see reductions in weed control. Sometimes around 10, we can see subtle differences. And I think once you get below 10, in terms of your gallons per acre, you're starting to potentially compromise these herbicides. And that's after a little bit of research, but more some discussions with the herbicide manufacturers. Some of them aren't confident once you get below 10 that that product is going to perform like you want it to. Okay, so again, this is crabgrass control. Bigger bars are better. Mostly just showing that Pilex plus Drive plus MSO was effective regardless of our application technique. Okay, you can also compare the green bars to these gray bars on the right. Drive Accelerate plus MSO will be the one we want to compare to, this one on the far right. The Pilex addition in the green compared to this gray on the right did give us a little bit more control, but it wasn't a lot. Sometimes we see Pilex improve control in some years and then not in others. I don't necessarily know why. The reason to add Pilex would be to pick up other weeds that Pilex is very good at controlling potentially. All right. So what are the conclusions from post-emergence crabgrass work in general? MSO is really important. It always improves our control. Pile driver improves control sometimes, but not always. We don't see a reduction in control when we use that we simulate that low volume sprayer application. And this is similar to other work done by Aaron Patton at Purdue with broadleaf weed herbicides, where he again similarly found that Z spray did not reduce the efficacy. Okay, so what's another key to post-emergence herbicide applications and getting them to work? This is some work we did with goosegrass, but it's crabgrass we expect would respond similarly. We evaluated various herbicides, both cool and warm season herbicides, and we subjected the goosegrass plants to various amounts of drought stress. We either had them under very low soil moisture, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen, less than 12% soil moisture, medium, or high. So in that low soil moisture, the plants were wilting pretty much all the time. In the medium moisture, they would wilt maybe in the middle of the day, and in the high moisture, they never wilted, a well-watered condition. So what you can see is regardless of our herbicide, the control is higher when we have a well-watered situation, right? So we've got our bars here. The bigger bars are above where we have high soil moisture. For every herbicide, it worked better when those plants were not under drought stress, when they were treated, and also afterwards. So the key is, I think, if you apply to drought stress plants and we don't get rain relatively soon, you should expect the herbicide to not work as well, potentially avoid applying it during those periods. Again, easier said than done, but just know these products are probably not going to work as well if we're in a real kind of serious drought situation where things are wilting in the middle of the day. So what are some other reasons your crabgrass control program might have failed? Right, here's a pretty nice stand of something, and we don't have good control. So in this case, this is actually kind of unique, although not so unique in this area anymore. This is actually Japanese stiltgrass. So what we see in this picture here is not crabgrass, although it looks like it, but upon closer inspection, we found it was Japanese stiltgrass. This is the #1 question I'm getting now in this Northeast region is how do I control Japanese stiltgrass? Because what I'm doing for crabgrass isn't working, right? So for those of you that are familiar with Japanese stiltgrass, it's typically a weed of woodland areas, right? We don't often see it in turf until recently. Here it is in the woods. It's an invasive species there, usually grows to a few feet high, chokes out all the native vegetation. It is a summer annual, just like crabgrass. Here's a picture of it in a turf setting. Here's some more pictures to help you identify it. This is how it gets its name, stiltgrass. It's basically as the stems grow up, they kind of fall to the ground and then they root at the nodes like stilts. Seed head there is pictured on the left. We don't often see a really good seed head in turf. But Japanese stiltgrass is really easy to pull out of the ground compared to crabgrass. So if you see something like this, what you want to do is see if it's easy to pull out of the ground, see if you've got kind of runners rooting at the nodes. The other thing you can look for is Japanese stiltgrass leaves are actually slightly asymmetrical. So this leaf on the right-hand side of the screen, you might notice that midrib is not quite down the center of the leaf. Again, it's kind of unusual for grasses that leaf is slightly asymmetrical. Where is stiltgrass? This is where it's primarily been reported. And again, until a few years ago, I wasn't really convinced it was a weed of turfgrass, that it was just sort of spilling out from these forested areas. But I've seen more and gotten more and more questions, so we're trying to understand how to control it. Essentially, the reason that it survives and does well in our lawns, even though it's a summer annual and you think we would be able to control it with our pre-emergence programs, is that it just germinates a lot earlier than crabgrass. So we don't have our pre-emergence herbicides out by the time it emerges. So we've seen emergence about a month before crabgrass in New Jersey. These are some of the dates. Okay, so it's emerging a month earlier than crabgrass. Most of our lawn care operators have not put out their pre-emergence herbicide then. If you don't put out a pre-emergence herbicide before a weed emerges, you will not effectively control it. When we've done research on stiltgrass, where we apply the pre-emergence herbicide before it emerges, regardless of the product, we get very good control. The post-emergence options for stiltgrass are more limited though, and we cannot use quinclorac, it doesn't work. Really the only option is phenoxaprop, which is a claim extra, and it's fairly expensive. We can get into details if you want about that. All right, so to conclude on crabgrass control is difficult. Multiple aspects need to be executed well. It's a very difficult weed to control if you don't do several things right. Good turf culture, pre-emergence herbicides, and possibly post-emergence herbicides are sort of real keys to control. We talked a lot about the nuance of all those aspects in the last 40 minutes. Communication between different parties responsible for different aspects of control is difficult, right? If you're just an applicator and you're not the one mowing the lawn, you're not the one seeding, whoever's mowing the lawn might be mowing it low. They might be seeding perennial ryegrass because it germinates very quickly and establishes well. It's going to be hard for you, the applicator, to say, well, what do I do in this yard where they've got good turf cover, and then I get blamed for this failure in this other yard where the situation's not the same, right? The other aspect is irrigation, right? So anyways, also, the weather can really ruin things quite a bit. When we have hot, wet summers, that's going to cause a more quick breakdown of those pre-emergence herbicides. And so what worked in a good weather year is not going to work in a hot and wet year, right? And then when we have multiple dry years, the turf thins out. And so, we're kind of on the edge here with these products and the rates we're allowed to use them at. And all the other things being thrown at us. So it's difficult. It requires a lot of things to come together to be good. With the last few minutes, I just want to touch on things that look like grasses, but I get a lot of questions about. I'll just give you my 2 cents about them. Yellow nutsedge, because I think it's a problem for everybody, and false green kalinga, which is another sedge species that's a big problem for a lot of us, particularly on the East Coast where we've got that more humid climate. So these are both sedge species, right? Sedges have edges. The things we do to control crabgrass are not what we need to do to control these sedges. These are both perennial sedges, false green kalinga and yellow nutsedge, and so pre-emergence herbicides are not going to have any effect. The post-emergence herbicides we talked about are not going to have any effect on them. I think a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with yellow nutsedge, which is pictured on the right-hand side of the screen. What's on the left is a weed that's, again, really problematic in sort of warmer, humid climates like mine in New Jersey, all the way through Indiana, up the East Coast and south of the Carolinas. So what's pictured on the left is actually not a grass. This is a sedge species, but it looks like a turf. It's got a really dense mat of rhizomes, whereas the nutsedge has underground tubers and tends to mix a little bit better with the turfgrass canopy. It doesn't generate quite as dense of a stand. Okay, and so with the kalinga and the nutsedge, our typical recommended timing was, June or July. What I tell people is spray your post-emergence herbicide once that stuff has emerged We've got enough leaf material there to absorb the herbicide. What I started to get questions about, well, I really don't want to wait that long. I'd rather get a jump on this, right around the time I'm applying my crabgrass pre-emergent and apply something to get out in front of it instead of waiting for it to green up and take over the lawn even more. So I'm going to talk about that with Kalinga. I also think it's important to get out in front of yellow nutsedge and make those applications earlier, because nutsedge reproduces from year to year via tubers, right? The nutsedge that's up or was killed after the first frost now is sitting in the soil as tubers. Those tubers will survive the winter and emerge next year. And those are kind of like our seed bank that we're worried about for crabgrass, but it's these underground tubers. So what's interesting about nutsedge is all this tuber production, we don't see it because it occurs below ground, but it actually begins 4 to 6 weeks after that nutsedge emerges. So when that nutsedge emerges in May and June, by the time we get to middle of June, early July, it's already started to produce tubers for next year. So where, again, I used to say maybe wait until July or so, mid-June to make those nutsedge applications. I think going earlier, if you can afford to make 2 applications, is better because it prevents the yellow nutsedge tuberization and setting next year's crop. Okay, so real quick, post-emergence herbicides are listed here. If you've done nutsedge control before, you're probably familiar with them. These are the different options: Solero, Prosedge, Vexus, and Archon, and then our sulfentrazone-based products. Okay, these are just the different states. For those of you in New York, you have fewer options. With all these products, whether it's Kalinga, which is pictured here, or nutsedge, it's going to be multiple applications, probably on a 6-week interval, possibly longer, but definitely twice during the season. Okay, I'm going to talk about Archon a little bit because it's a relatively new product and we've done some work with it. It's safe on all of our cool season turfgrass species. This is liquid pyramesulfan. This is some work we did to kind of get at that question of, could we actually go earlier than that typical June timing? So what we did here is we actually applied Archon on April 15th, and then we made another application on June 2nd. So this is April 15th, much earlier than we would typically apply it. The Kalinga or the nutsedge hasn't even emerged when we've made this application. But what we found was when we made that application at the pre-emergence crabgrass timing, followed it by a June application 6 weeks later, we actually got really good control, better control than we would from a single application alone. So this has led me to be more comfortable with the people that want to go out and get in front of things. Even though we don't have those plants that have necessarily emerged, you can go ahead and make that application. This is just showing the control from the different products, and that potentially tank mixing it with your crabgrass pre-emergence product will work. Now, if you do this early application, I want to highlight that if you do an application at crabgrass pre-emergence, that cannot be your only application for the year. It's got to be followed with a second application 6 to 8 weeks later. And these bars highlighted by the red here are showing how much more effective a 2 application program was than a 1 application program. All right. So again, Kalinga sedge conclusions: start early, especially for yellow nutsedge. Early is better than late because we prevent that tuber production. It's going to be multiple applications, likely over multiple years. For us, we talked about the different products briefly. Solero has been much more effective against Kalinga. In our work, product selection is a lot less important for yellow nutsedge. It's more about how many applications can you make. Are you making them at the right time? All right, so that is the end. I'll take any questions, or if I guess I've been answering them all the way through. So this concludes the presentation. Thanks everybody for having me.